this video, we'll think about social and media constructions of gender. We will think about what gender is, how gender identity is constructed, and how women and men are represented in the media. My opening question for you in this video is, are women and men opposites or not? This is supposed to be a challenging question and you won't be able to answer it with a simple yes or no. Anytime I ask students this question, even those who say yes they are, tend to continue with but. It seems that on one level we're encouraged to think of women and men as opposites, but when we really think about it, we realise that while they are perhaps different in some ways, they are actually remarkably similar. There's been lots of research in recent years that has shown lots of similarities between women and men in many things, in emotions, in practical skills, in all of these things that we think we're different on. Why not do some research and see if you can find some different arguments about this? As well as thinking about whether there are differences between women and men, we need to think about the reasons for the differences. Do they occur biologically, or do they occur sociologically or environmentally? That is, are they constructed by who you are, how you are raised and who you spend time with? This is sometimes described as the nature versus nurture debate. I think Simone de Beauvoir, one of the most famous gender studies scholars, captures this issue we're exploring really succinctly in her famous quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." De Beauvoir was focusing on women because the book she was writing was exploring women's identity and position, but the same could be said of men. One is not born, but rather becomes a man. Why not pause the video here and have a think about what de Beauvoir was getting at when she wrote this? It's talking about that socialisation thing, isn't it? It's talking about that environmental thing. So biologically, the majority of people have female or male sex assigned to them at their birth, but de Beauvoir's point is about gender. She is saying that we grow into our gender, that our gender is all about the socialisation and the experiences and the expectations made of us. Sometimes we perform in the way we do because of the expectations that there are about how we should perform. Yes, that's all changing a lot, and certainly has changed significantly in most societies since the time that de Beauvoir was writing, but it still happens and is still relevant. Simply put then, sex is biological and gender is social. It's a lot more complex than that, but for our purposes this overall distinction is a useful one to make. Given that, it is useful to ask whether we perceive the differences between women and men to be more significant than they are because society encourages us to do so and is always talking to us about how we're different. By way of illustration, I'm going to present the differences of opinion around this nature and nurture issue as relating to the approaches of a couple of social theorists as what they would say about it. These are not things they did say, but rather applying their approach to what we're talking about. It's useful for you to begin to think about theorists in this way, as having an approach or a position, a lens through which to view things, if you will. Like if they were sitting in a coffee shop or at a dinner party with one another debating a topic, what would they say about it? Louis Althusser's approach to this would be that we are interpellated or addressed in ways that position us as either feminine or masculine. Althusser coined the term interpellation, which you probably haven't come across before. It means speaking to, hailing, or addressing. An example of this is how we speak to little children. Not in terms of the sounds we make and so on that we talked about in the age video, but in different ways to do with gender. When you're speaking to young children, do you make a difference in the way you speak, in the words you use, and in the things that you say, depending on whether that little person is a girl or a boy? I think we do, though we like to think we don't. We probably would like to think that, oh, I wouldn't do that because I wouldn't differentiate. I want equality of experience for all children, etc., etc. However, I think we all do it to a certain extent. Have you ever said, "Who's a pretty little girl?" or "Aren't you a little princess?" If you have, I bet you didn't say it to a boy. Or have you ever said, "Aren't you a cheeky face?" or "Aren't you a brave soldier?" If you have, you probably didn't say it to a girl. If you think about it from the child's point of view, in one sense it might be great that people are speaking to you and encouraging you to speak, interact and develop. But in another sense, if people are speaking to you in these gendered ways, they are perhaps encouraging you to act and behave differently from children of the other gender. And it is therefore more likely that you will do so. And it is therefore more likely that children will grow up having developed some gendered differences between them. Perhaps the next time you're talking to your own children, young siblings, nieces, nephews, cousins or friends' children, you will pause and reflect on whether you're doing this and the extent to which you're doing it. This doesn't just happen to children. Let's think about how we are addressed in gendered ways by some adverts. Consider the following 4 adverts, which are all for the same product type, moisturising skincare. Take a moment to see if you can identify patterns. These 2 are adverts for moisturising skincare targeted at women. And here are 2 adverts for moisturising skincare targeted at men. If you want to have another look, why not pause the video and jump back a little bit and have another look at them to see if you can see any patterns. So did you notice any patterns? For the women, the focus is age, and in particular aiming to look young. Whilst these are just a couple of examples, and there is no claim that they are representative of all advertising of moisturiser, in my experience this is a common focus. Why not have a look more broadly yourself and consider whether the pattern also exists in the context of the advertising you come into contact with? This begs the question, if the focus for women is looking young, and that isn't the focus for men, is that something to do with a societal norm about gender and how people of different ages are valued depending on what gender they are? If you're really switched on, you'll pick up here that what we're dealing with is an intersection between gender and age. For the adverts targeted at men, it's all about activity. It's about energy and body conditioning. The Nivea advert takes the masculine stereotype of one's body as a whole, being fit, toned and muscular, and applies it to just one part of the body, the skin. Keep your skin in shape. We could argue that applying this particular stereotype of masculinity without question to a part of the body to which it is not usually applied, or to which it has not been applied in the past, naturalizes it by repeating it and reinforcing it. An important thing to note here is that gender representations, and in fact representations of any aspect of identity, position everyone. We might argue that a man being positioned as strong and active is more empowering than a woman being positioned as having to avoid getting old, but nevertheless, both are positions that put limitations on the identity construction of the 2 genders to some degree. Does this remind you of anything? It's a bit like when we were talking about stereotypes and we reminded ourselves that actually stereotypes do not have to be negative, they can be positive, but still limiting by categorizing people by putting them in some sort of box. A useful way to theorize these differences of representation is to consider the concept of discourse. Yes, these differences are examples of different stereotypes, but discourse allows us to draw several stereotypes together into a more systematic representation. As I've mentioned to you before, it's common for concepts to be named with words which society already uses in a non-academic everyday way. Discourse is an example of that. You've maybe heard the term used to mean communication or conversation, for example. But academic theorists tend to use terms to mean more specific things. That does not, however, mean that they are necessarily complicated. Sometimes when faced with theoretical terms, we presume they are complicated, but they are often just an observation that no one has made before or that no one has given a name to before. Another layer of complexity, or confusion, depending on how you look at it, is that even within academia, a term can have a number of different but related meanings, depending on which school of thought or approach we are dealing with. So in this discussion, we are using discourse in the way We're using discourse in the way Michel Foucault used it. I'm making some general points here about the kinds of things he said. These aren't direct quotes, they're approaches, positions. Foucault says that discourses are simply ways of talking about things. So the examples we've just looked at illustrate how, when we're talking about health and body image, we tend to talk differently about the same things depending on whether we're talking about women or men. Skincare for women is talked about in the context of maintaining youth, and skincare for men is talked about in the context of maintaining energy. Foucault goes on to say that different discourses are in competition with one another, and some win out and become what he calls dominant discourses. So when considering our examples, it is not the case that skincare for women is always about maintaining youth, or that skincare for men is always about maintaining energy. Other discourses are used, perhaps even the same discourses for the other gender in some examples. Crucially, though, the pattern is the more often used discourse, or the dominant discourse, for women is maintaining youth, and for men is maintaining energy. More broadly, we could consider how those discourses around a specific type of skincare actually feed into and reinforce discourses about health more broadly. For women, the dominant discourse of health is looking young, whereas for men, the dominant discourse of health is energy and body conditioning. You may have noticed a parallel here with several of the other things we have talked about in this module. Passivity versus activity. Women are encouraged by the dominant discourses that position them to be passive, to be looked at, and men are encouraged by the dominant discourses that position them to be active. So, to go back to our opening question, do we perceive the differences between women and men to be more significant than they are because society and the media encourage us to do so? Another useful social theorist in this discussion is Erving Goffman. Goffman would say that we construct gender along with the other aspects of our identity in everyday interaction. You could say it's a performance. This is not to say that we're all always faking it. Performance in this sense is about proactively presenting yourself in a certain way. If we think back to the different types of drawing and colouring in that we considered as analogies for how ideology works, we could see Althusser as a traditional colouring book, not telling us what colour to put where, but certainly recognising the limits of the choices we can make. Goffman, on the other hand, is more like the drawing tablet, just drawing your own picture, wiping it clean and starting over again with a different picture if you like. To use another analogy, can you tell I like analogies? These differences and tensions can be viewed a bit like a tug of war between what social theory calls structure and what it calls agency. Identity and opportunity are partly limited by societal structures such as education, the legal system, the political system, religion and the media, and you partly have agency, or in everyday language, the ability to make choices and do things that you want to do the way that you want to do them. The same goes for gender identity more specifically. Your gender identity and opportunity are affected by the extent to which these societal structures and the potential for agency are gendered. Some of the limitations are about gender norms and gender expectations. These interact with norms and expectations related to many different aspects of identity and experience, such as social class, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, and so on. Of course, when we're thinking about gender, we need to look beyond just thinking about women and men or femininity and masculinity. Do you think any of the theorists we've considered enable us to look beyond seeing gender as a binary thing? Your answer is probably some, or sort of, or partly. If you're interested, do some research and try to find a theorist or two who encourages us to think in new and more current ways about gender. I'd like you to do a couple of tasks now. The first is a personal reflection on your own experience. Pause the video here and think about these questions. Next, I want you to try to analyse some gender representations in your media consumption. Here are the questions I'd like you to consider. So, what points did you make in answer to the questions in the media task? I know that my viewing habits are very different to most of yours, but I tried to put myself in your shoes. I wonder if I was successful. Did any of you think about Grey's Anatomy? I know it's a firm favourite of some students. Grey's Anatomy is a great show to analyse the gender representations in. They're complex. We see different characters of the same gender having differently gendered things happen to them and reacting differently. And we see complexity within the experience of individual characters as regards gender. I wonder if you've watched any of the older series of Grey's Anatomy. The show has been around for quite a long time, and that makes it even more interesting in terms of gender. If you've watched past series, have you noticed shifts and developments over time as regards the gendered experiences of the different characters and how these are represented televisually? I'd love to hear what you think about that. Now, I wonder if any of you thought about RuPaul's Drag Race. I know this is another firm favourite of some students. If you did think about this show, no doubt you thought about ways in which it challenges gender norms. Certainly when I was your age, there was no show on TV celebrating drag and alternative identities and performances of identity in the way that RuPaul's Drag Race does. However, if you think more critically about the show, there are gaps, aren't there? There are gaps in terms of inclusion of trans people, and there are gaps in terms of inclusion of drag kings. Why not do a little bit of research and look into the debates around these issues? Again, I'd love to know what you think. Well, that's everything for this key content video. I hope you've enjoyed exploring societal and media constructions of gender with me. See you in the next video.